Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Christian's Question, a project of the New Tolerance Campaign. Today I have a great guest with me, Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University and the author of the books Taboo: 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, Hate Crime Hoax, and the $50 million question. I hope I'm saying that right. He is currently working at the upcoming project Alt Wrongs, an American case against racial nationalism, as well as sketching out a book looking at the transgender, gender fluid, and other kin communities and the idea of flexible identities. Reilly has published pieces in Academic Questions, Commentary, Quillette, and a number of other journals and magazines. His research interests include international relations and the prevention of war, contemporary American race relations, and the use of modern quantitative methods to test sacred cow theories, such as the existence of widespread white privilege. Off work, he enjoys dogs, archery, basketball, Asian cooking, and beer. Reilly has been described by himself as the greatest mind of a generation. How are you doing today, Dr. Reilly?
I'm doing very well.
Thank
Good
you
good to
so
be on the program.
Thank you so much for coming on and for
Sure.
talking with us. So, I want to focus our conversation today on your upcoming book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curriculum. And our viewers who would like to get the book or who would like to pre-order the book, rather, the link will be in the comment section down below. But tell us about the thesis of the book and what you were trying to approach by writing it.
Yeah, well, the thesis of the book is very simple, that most kind of upper middle class Americans have been told a particular narrative about American society for a long time. I mean, I would say in the urban North, obviously the South had more racial problems, but since the 1960s, the summers of love, and that narrative centers on certain ideas about unique Western negativity. So, for example, we often hear that slavery was America's unique original sin. We hear, I mean, if you think about Kendi 2019, Nicole Hannah-Jones 2020, that slavery was done differently in the United States from the way this practice occurred everywhere else in the world. We hear that the country was taken in intentional, unprovoked genocide from the Native Americans, and this just goes on and on. I mean, we ended World War II with atrocities and should apologize to the Japanese and the Germans has recently become somewhat popular. I mean, insane to me, but an idea you hear in the debate press. And what's more, this idea is presented as radical and new. So when you look at books like Howard Zinn's The People's History of America or Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee or the 1619 Project Curriculum, what they're saying is not just, well, we advocate for this very negative view of America and of the West. And that's the conventional view, which it is, at least above the middle class. What they're saying is we're presenting this very negative, hyperbolic view of the West, and we are the rebels. This is how you get the entire mainstream Democratic Party, plus the socialists and the Greens, collectively referring to themselves as the resistance. And to the ousted former president as kind of the powerhouse, the cathedral. Now, obviously, of course, Joe Biden, formerly a mainstream Democrat, has been president for 3 or 4 years now. But it doesn't change the idea. So point one is the West is extremely negative. Point two is we are the brave, rebellious truth tellers that are telling you this. And what I point out in the book is that this is all bullshit. I mean, excuse the language, but one, this has been the dominant curriculum for 50 years in the schools and higher education and the media. I give examples. And two, it's basically wrong. I mean, slavery, I did a deep dive on slavery inspired by everyone from Thomas Sowell to Tipu Tip in terms of writers of books in the past. And I mean, I think you can say fairly and honestly that one of the first 25 or so human words was slave. I mean, if you go back to the old Sumerian glyphs, I mean, there's an image that means warrior from the mountains or man from the mountains, and another image in front of it that means shackles. Like one of the first things that people did during the ancient wars, during the Sargon of Akkad style era of the first empires, was move from just killing and eating all their battle captives to enslaving them and making them do work that no one else wanted to do. And all of this was quote unquote chattel slavery. You could buy a battle captive, you could sell one. Their children, probably 75+% of the time, were slaves. This persisted on through ancient Greece. I mean, Aristotle wrote essays about how to train and keep your slaves. This persisted on through ancient Rome. 1 in 5 people was a slave. We were doing this in, civilized Black Africa, Arabic Africa, the places where I would assume both of our ancestors came from. You know, the kings of Ghana and these pretty significant black kingdoms, Aksum and Ethiopia, I mean, had tens of thousands of slaves. When a king died, you'd sacrifice 3,000 for good luck. The Arabs, probably even worse than the whites or the blacks. Obviously, no reflection on people of Arabic descent today, but the Arabic slave trade took 17 million people out of Africa, maybe 9 million out of kind of poor Southern Europe. You're talking about the Slavic areas. I mean, went on for much longer than the white or the black African slave trades. So this is just a practice that's been universal for humans throughout history. If you beat a group of people in a war or you gain an advantage over them in trade, you can buy and sell them. And that meets some of the darker needs of society, whether that's combat within the society, like the Roman gladiators, bodyguarding, bizarre sexual tastes among the rich. Like, unfortunately, if you lost, that was your fate for most of history. So I break this down. And I say, well, this doesn't excuse modern slavery, sure, but it's important that anything that happened in our society be understood in this context. What's the unique thing that the modern English-speaking West brought to the ancient slave markets? I mean, we ended them. I mean, white and to a significant extent, free, black, Irish, whatever, American units broke the South, won the Civil War. I mean, around the world, the British sent their navy to patrol the world ocean and to free people, to blockade slave ports, to shut down entire significant states like Zanzibar. So I do this full analysis of slavery, and I say, not only is our society not the worst in the world, during an era when everyone engaged in things that we no longer do, we were one of the better societies in the world. And I call out something that I think, and this will be the last thing because I'm a lengthy talker, but I call out something that I see a lot when I read political science and history today, which is extreme presentism. So what you do is single out one society that you think you can criticize. So a lot of liberal whites will say, well, we're only focusing on European descent societies. We can't ethically talk about any others. So you separate us or whoever from the block of nations around the world. And then you apply to the one country you're going to criticize a very modern standard where you say, well, if we accept that enslaving your war captives is evil, which is the case under modern law, then everyone in this society was evil. The catch with that is, even if you assume that there are ultimate rights and wrongs, which frankly I probably don't, that doesn't mean you should have slaves or anything like that, but there are very different rules in different societies across history. But even if you accept this, it's a somewhat meaningless critique. No one in that society knew about or recognized that rule, except for a few people that are the equivalent of our fringe vegans today. One, and two, critiques of our society would be just as easy and plausible. There are 2 million people who are technical prostitutes on OnlyFans right now, for example. And it's, I mean, we're having, but it's somewhat entertaining to think of what Jefferson or Mansa Musa or any historical leader would think about that. What are you doing? You're allowing this risk of disease and so on to your daughters, factory farming, nuclear weaponry. I mean, so those critiques could be made of any society by applying an external, non-relevant morality, and that's true of us as well. But in reality, they are only ever made of one society, our own. So that went on for a while, but I basically make this point across 10 chapters. So there's slavery, there's Native American culture. I have a great deal of admiration for the natives as warriors and poets and so on. But the idea that these were peaceful societies is insane. So I talk about that. I talk about Native American history, go into the Aztecs for a couple pages. You know, there's the history of military conflict. Did we do anything unusual in World War II? Well, not by the standards of that time. I point out that the enemies were the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese. So just the book is almost fun in points, in sections, because of the absurdity of what's being argued against. But I think the core argument is very serious and it holds together very well.
Yeah, well, that's all very good information. You put a lot on the table, so let me try to parse through some of it.
For sure.
One of the most enduring myths I think that I've seen personally in my own educational history has been about the Civil War, and most importantly, about some of the antecedents to the Civil War. A lot of people will say that the Constitution was founded on slavery to the exclusion of Black people. And a lot of people will say that the South initially wanted to have Black slaves because they were racist. Although, if you look at the historical record, it appears as if a lot of the arguments initially made for slavery in the South were due to economic or agricultural reasons. So can you kind of explore that genre of mythology that a lot of Americans take for granted is true?
Sure. Let me, well, actually, let me awkwardly get up and get a pen here.
Okay.
So I think there, boom, that was it. So I think there are a couple of different things there. So founded, I mean, first of all, the USA wasn't founded on slavery. I'll get to that in a second.
Yep.
Out of slavery. So a couple different things. First of all, the claim the United States was founded on slavery to me is like claiming that the United States was founded on beaver trapping or something like that. Slavery was something that existed at this time. And today we find that unfortunate. And I actually have a great rant about whether there were ultimate morals and gods and goddesses and so on that it would take up like 40 minutes. I'm not going to go into here. But whether or not we think that this is something that is never okay today, and I will note that a great many products that we enjoy today are made by slaves, something that causes me some qualms when I look at an iPhone or something like that. But the simple reality is that every society at this time, or at least the large majority of them, we could say all the Arabic societies, we could say all of the New World societies, so on down the line, all these civilized African societies had the institution of slavery. The West obviously bought slaves from the civilized African societies. So founded on implies that one of the core principles of the new nation that was being developed was this institution. And that is not accurate, in my opinion, as a pretty good social science researcher. But when you read through the Constitution, I mean, obviously, Article 1 is the Congress. And there's a great description in there of the duties and tasks of a government that goes on for almost a page. And but it's actually quite limited. I'm sure you recognize as someone who also slants right. I mean, you can tax and you can fight wars, but you can't actually do probably many of the things that the government has decided to take on today. There's no mention of controlling education or this sort of thing. It's stuff like establishing post roads. But anyway, Article 2 is the presidency. You need one strong executive leader. I think most people who've been in leadership roles would agree on that. Article 3 is the courts. And you go on and on and on. I mean, you go into the amendments, free speech, bearing arms. Slavery is mentioned once in the context of representational apportionment for the Congress. And the question there, even this is spun, by the way, by the political left. The argument is something like, excuse the language, but those racist crackers wanted to count us as 3/5 of a man. The problem with that is that if you counted black slaves as full people, the South would have been the most powerful region of the country because slave masters would have counted their slaves and then overcounted their slaves and given these incredible population totals to the National Congress by saying, well, these people are half a person. You're not saying that's true in some moral sense. There was a considerable initiative in the USA to convert enslaved persons to Christianity. What you're saying is you're not letting slaves vote. So it's absurd for us to let you count them toward the voting populational total. But that's the only mention of slavery in, as far as I'm familiar, the core constitutional document before you get to the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So to say we were founded on slavery, no, that's not accurate. We had slavery during a time when most Western societies had slavery. Those that didn't, by the way, had systems that were almost as cruel. Have you ever heard Tennessee Ernie Ford, I owe my soul to the company store?
Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I've heard it for the first time, like played live down here in Kentucky. And it's actually pretty moving. I mean, it's this guy who's hauling about 16, this white guy, by the way. It wouldn't matter. They were very integrated down the mines here. But I mean, it's a guy who's hauling 16 tons of coal a day, and he's bemoaning the fact that doing that for the rest of his life is never going to pay off the unpayable debt that he took off on as a young man coming back from the wars. So in regions that didn't have slavery, you had serfdom. So you're technically free, but you can't leave your land, a bit limiting. You had peonage where you're free to go do whatever as soon as you pay your unpayable debt. If you try to leave before that, you'll be horsewhipped. That's what Ernie Ford's talking about. I mean, all these different things. Indentured servitude, which is how most poor whites came to the USA. You're a slave, but you only have to work for massa for 23 years. And when that gets done, you're free to go. The problem is that life expectancy is 28. I mean, it's just on and on and on with this. And all of that was recognized at the time. The founding fathers had to deal with these grievous human problems. But no, the country wasn't founded on peonage or something like that. In fact, kind of last point before I get to racism and slavery wasn't how we did this at the start of matters in the USA. I mean, the first slave owner was probably a black guy. Something I talk about in the book. Can we blame Brother Anthony Johnson for this? But for the
Oh,
first 60, 70 years of farming in the New English colonies, what you had was indentured servitude for blacks and whites. And again, this was you were bought in Africa after your tribe lost the war, or you were shipped out of Scotland after your clan lost the war. And the deal was you have to go to this new country, you have to work for 20 years, and after that, you can be a free landowner. So both blacks and whites, by the tens of thousands, were let go to farm following this model. Finally, a guy who was either black or more than half black, probably just black African, wanted one of his bond servants not to leave. And this bond servant, just by the luck of the draw, happened to be a black guy, happened to be a guy named John Kasor. And he sued and said that, a recalcitrant servant or something like that should be sentenced to servitude for the rest of their life. And the court said, okay. And they did this with this gentleman, young Mr. Kasor. And the reality is, because this was a black person, because African descent was referenced in the case, so on down the line, slavery became more and more of an institution over the years and was targeted primarily at black people. Like, I think that's a pretty fair statement. But we didn't initially begin with a full-on slave system. We began with a system of bond servitude, which was roughly as abusive to whites as to blacks. Did slavery grow out of racism? From what I've just said, it's difficult to imagine that it did globally or here. I think what you have is an issue of reverse causation. So racism grew out of slavery. You've got a model here as you move past bond servitude, where the majority of slaves and then all slaves are black. And these people seem, I mean, if you look at black Americans, to be physically fit, reasonably, if they come from the cities of Africa, intellectually sound people, but they're out there hoeing rows for the rest of their lives. How do you justify that? Well, you come up with a new narrative about the inherent inferiority of black people. That could be cultural. I mean, there were people who referred to black slaves as having been rescued from the fever swamps of Africa. What is it? Louse eating, devil worshipping barbarians from Dahomey, this sort of thing. That was one take on black slaves. Another one was that, and this is something that still leaves sour fruit today, right? Another take was that black people were genetically inferior. There was no way they could be trained, no way they could be educated. They were made to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, to quote the Bible. So this idea grew up to justify slavery. When you look at native slaveholders, which I did pretty extensively in the book, or when you look at black African slave traders like Tipu Tip, greatest slave trader of all time, was a black guy. I don't know if greatest is the word, but I mean, they didn't really make any excuses. It was literally just resisting my own tendency toward glibness, but it was just, you lost the war, get on the boat. You're going to develop your agricultural skills for a period of time. In America, that didn't suffice. And one reason that didn't suffice, last sentence, is that we were a democracy. So Tipu Tip was just an African general. Like, in his opinion, if he beat the other group, he was better than the other group for a preset period of time. They had to work for him. Later, they might evolve to fighting for him. That's what this was. That's what this had always been. This is Julius Caesar in his letters. In the USA, we moved past that idea. We moved toward the idea that everyone has a sort of inherent God-given value. So we had to explain why slaves didn't. And I think that's where scientific racism comes from.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, that's a very, some people would argue we're seeing a resurgence in kind of scientific racism a lot in recent times. What do you think about that?
I think we are. I mean, so it's interesting because I don't like dismissing scientific theories as racist.
Right.
So, I mean, like, I've had this conversation with my white and black buddies. And I mean, I'm sure you've heard the stereotypes in something like a men's group chat. Like, there are things black guys think they're better than white guys at, let's say, at a PG level. There are things white guys think they're better than black guys at. And
Basketball.
people joke about those that both groups think they can do, like playing some football. Like, not
Yeah.
all those people are racist. But I do think that what you're talking about with scientific racism is a genetics only explanation for relatively small group differences that focuses only on specific groups. So, like, every time I go online and I Google something like race debate or race and IQ, you see a lot of people debating the black-white IQ gap in America. And I think that a lot of people in this debate are by any neutral standard racists. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, American blacks and whites both perform very normally in global terms. If you look at tested IQs around the world, and you're going from Central Africa through the stands and deep Eastern Europe, through Latin America, through Western Europe, so on, you see an incredibly broad range. I mean, if you use the Lin and von Hanen data set that's very popular in these kind of circles, tested human IQs range from, I think, 57 up to 109, something like that. And that's an improvement over what we used to get during the 1940s. I mean, Nepal, which is actually an Asian hardworking country, once posted a national average of 42. So, I mean, one,
Wow.
the black-white gap, whites are currently, I think, 102, blacks at 91 in the USA. That's Charles Murray, not exactly a hippie. 2020, there's been a little improvement for both groups. It's not extraordinarily significant. And what that range from 42 or 57 up over 100 says to me is that the large majority of this has to be cultural in the broad sense of that term. There's no population where, older term here, but where the majority of people are mentally retarded. And I don't want to stereotype it, especially not an Asian population. I mean, that's very unlikely. What's probably the case is if you educate people for an average of 4 or 5 years, and you don't educate women at all, you're a traditional African or East Euro society, those people are going to score pretty poorly on something like the WISC, the intelligence test for older children. They're not going to be able to read. Rotating shapes is going to be a novel idea. So saying that someone who doesn't know vocabulary, doesn't know geometry, can go in and ace these tests strikes me as pretty idiotic. So you're seeing things like this where there's slight black dominance, there's slight white dominance, there's a gap that's existed for maybe 40 years. I think where you get into racism is where people say, well, that's 100% due to genes or 75+% due to genes or whatever, and we can never fix it. My take would be, I'm not sure any of that's due to genes, but we know that 50+% of it, looking at what's called the Flynn effect, so on down the line over the years, is cultural. We know a lot of this is fixable. And this is true for most things, by the way. Crime in the USA increased 500%, 820% for blacks between 1963 and 1993. So there's no propensity for Americans, or indeed Black Americans, to commit crime at that post-George Floyd level. There are variables that affect that, like whether the police are allowed to make arrests. So, I mean, I think the same thing, generally speaking, is true for education, so on. It's true for grades. It's more than 50% true for board scores and IQ scores. And it's fine to have a conversation about that, but that has to be the starting point. You can't point to the 58 score and say, well, look, Africans are dumber than chimpanzees. Like, that's where you get into, I mean, like, literally, the score for chimpanzees is like 70. That's where you get into just outspoken racism. Like, we all know that's not true. Like, you taught the chimp to read. The kid who's 5 and Benin has not had that experience. So anyway, we are seeing a bit more of this. I don't think all hereditarianism is racism. I do think, though, that we are post-Elon, post-backlash to BLM, we are seeing more guys who are open racists. Like, profile picture is a Roman statue shaking hands with Adolf Hitler if you're on socials, and they are very involved in these conversations. And I don't think you would disagree with that.
No, not at all, not at all. I've noticed it, and it seems really concerning because there does seem to be a very important debate to be had around, cultural and social differences and outcomes between groups. But when people are just trying to use it to fit their narrative as opposed to actually engage the material independently, then that's when it gets concerning, it seems. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, one quick comment I would make there. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So one thing that I would say, if you're looking for a serious hereditarian debater, like what's the solution? I mean, it strikes me that a number of things, from high IQ Nigerian immigration, I mean, Igbo Nigerians are some
Yeah.
of the smartest people in the
Mhm.
world,
Yep.
to interracial dating. I mean, a number of things. You're not going to force any of them on free citizen, but a number of things could easily close these kind of gaps. So, I mean, my focus would be one, 70% of it, let's say, I pulled that completely out of my ass, like everyone does in this field. But if that percentage is entirely cultural, I mean, let's really crack down on Black, Southern white, et cetera, schools. You don't get to graduate kids that can't read. Let's fix almost all of this first. And then if there's some residual genetic gap of 4 points or something like that, I mean, what do you do about that? Could immigration policy close that? So I think that's the non-racist approach to this. And again, I tend to think this is almost all cultural, but even if you don't, these are practical solutions. Like, if crime increased 800%, what do we need to do with these police forces to get crime back down? And it's worth noting that I now see this on all sides of the fence, just like the useless critique of the other man. So, I mean, there are a bunch of studies that find that Caucasians have like 3 times the suicide rate of Blacks. They're more likely to OD, technically have smaller penises. I'm not really going to read this type of crap and like comment on it. It's like, it would be very easy to be like I mean, you have some of these guys like Great House, who's a very funny guy online, but who will just post this kind of stuff. And then you have a white guy under that posting the IQ charts, and they'll argue for 5 hours. And I don't really see that that does anything. Like the
Yeah,
majority of
it does.
whites aren't suicidal, asexual lunatics. Majority of black people aren't criminals. So what do you do about those small percentages of people? I think that's the real question.
Absolutely. So let's go back to Native Americans because I that's also a very fertile ground for myths. So a lot of people, the traditional conventional view is that America came over, both colonists and others displaced Native Americans, genocided them, killed them, kicked them off their land, and then America was built upon that foundation. What do you say to that?
Well, I think a couple things. First of all, I don't think anyone thinks that the white settlers, or for that matter, the black Buffalo soldiers, always treated the natives with kind kid gloves. I mean, nothing in my book is intended to be nonsensical, jingoistic. In fact, I criticize the two bad ways we've taught history in the past, and that's the other one. But I mean, many of these claims that come from like the Nicole Hannah Joneses of the world are just empirically not true. They're exaggerations by an order of magnitude. And it's important to be able to say that. Like the fact that Native Americans lost the war overall, not to keep using that phrase, that doesn't mean that this was a genocide, that every battle was a Native defeat, that the country owes a debt, any of that. It just means that's a historical fact. The Saxons lost the war too. They're not, the people of French descent aren't giving back England. So what do I actually think about that? One, genocide is a term that doesn't make a lot of sense here for two reasons. First, there are obviously tens of millions of Native Americans alive today, nearly full-blooded, representing the large majority of the great tribes in this country. So when you talk about something like an intentional genocide, that's not how it works. I think the USA cheated on the majority of their treaties. But when you look at the Navajo Nation out in the Southwest, I mean, that's the size of many states. And it's not entirely poor land. I mean, so that is not how intentional genocides operate, that after one side is defeated, they get 60% of their original territories and they still live there today. That again doesn't mean there weren't military atrocities on both sides. It's just words have meaning. The Israeli-Palestinian war is not a genocide. A genocide is the intentional extermination of an ethnic group. That was the only term used until quite recently. Now it's the intentional extermination or attempted extermination combined with slaughter of a large percentage, so on. Even that's debatable in the Native context. And that gets us into point two, which was that about 95% of Native American casualties were caused by disease. So this is something
Wow.
that I think most smart people know, but that we don't think enough about. So Europeans and West Asians including Turks, I mean, many of the people that in practice were sailing with the Spanish fleet, so on. Europeans and West Asians evolved in what's probably the world's most intense disease environment, except maybe the Yalu River area in China. I mean, Jared Diamond does a good job on this in Guns, Germs, and Steel. So you have large livestock. You've got not just goats and sheep, but cattle, horses. I mean, up until the high Middle Ages, these lived in your house. If you were wealthy enough to own them, you didn't want them attacked by wolves. You'd either have them coming into the building itself, or you'd have a pinned enclosure right outside the building, a fenced-in farmyard. And those animals carry diseases. Cowpox comes from cows. Smallpox, I believe, evolved from a disease that chickens have. Even AIDS, allegedly, humans contracted from monkeys while hunting or whatever in Central Africa. So the old worlders that came over here came from this disease world, and they brought these diseases with them. Like actual plague was a common disease at this point. Leprosy was not uncommon. You might have a sailor with a rotting hand covered in clots. Smallpox, influenza, the common flu is fatal to people that have never been exposed. So when the Spaniards fought the Aztecs, I think there's a tendency for any kind of any male who's interested in military science, certainly, to say how they beat them. The Aztecs had poorer weapons. You're talking about stone and some copper, maybe bronze, but they had regiments of longbowmen. Like they should have easily just wiped out the Spaniards, just shoot for the face. The reason that the Spaniards beat them is that the Aztecs contracted diseases after each skirmish. And so you'd go back home, and then your general, I mean, imagine the horror of this. Then your general would die. Then half your soldiers would die. Everyone else would be incapacitated for a week. The Spanish army would just bind up their wounds and recover, and they'd come back to the field and they'd face half as many men. So that happened throughout the Americas. I mean, when the first Spanish explorers came to the USA and wandered down the Mississippi, they described what they encountered, like this very civilized mound builder culture, cities of 10,000 people, so on. When later explorers, English fighters, and so on came through that same area, what they found was a giant Golgotha of bones. Like everyone had died because plague had been contracted, it had laid low in trade goods, this kind of thing, not intentionally, and it had spread. And this had gone on, bouncing back and forth among the villages and towns for 20, 30, 40 years. So at this point, there were no people. There were what are described as like starving hunters living in the woods. So that's terrible, but very little of that had to do with white rifles being dramatically better than Indian longbows or something. So, one, there are a bunch of Native Americans alive today and honor to their resilience and bravery. But two, it wasn't battle defeat that broke the natives. It was the introduction of these new diseases that reduced the native population by about 95%. And after that point, whites and natives often lived in relative peace. The issue is just, what do you do if you are a person from a previously existing society that's been cut to 1/20th of what it was, watching these other people come over and often peacefully buy land, marry your daughter, so on? Like, how do you keep your culture intact? Many natives simply blended into white society. Others moved west to the high plains and fought until they were finally defeated. That's what we think of as the Indian Wars. That was a very small chunk of this whole period of about 400 years. But just the idea that the whites came over with one organized plan and one good leader and genocided the Native Americans, no, that is not realistic.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's very important information. A lot of people think that it was Columbus, and then after that, just destruction, and it was just all death and all that kind of stuff. So it's very good to establish the context. So my last question, because it's been a great interview, but we're going to wrap them up. In the description for your book, you mention how people believe something about communist in Hollywood. What's the
Oh, yeah.
mythology surrounding that?
Well, this gets into, I think one reason that a lot of these mythologies exist is that there's an organized left in the West that hates the West. And this is a really unique phenomenon that comes out of our almost excessive free speech culture. Um, I think you should be able to say anything. I also think that a gentleman often doesn't, would be how I would phrase it. And when you see some of these stories, there's a Spanish politician that was recently fired because he was videotaping himself eating, let's put it politely and say, human feces, and requesting that other men send him this delicacy and so on down the line. And I think there's something to be said for a code of laws that would harshly punish you for doing this. Like, we don't need politicians that are public shit eaters. I mean, it's extremely bizarre behavior. And you see that this ultimate culture of freedom very often in the West. I mean, we just mentioned scientific racism. In the modern West, you can be a Nazi. Outside of Germany, no one's going to restrict you. You can have your Hitler profile picture and log into your computer from an easily trackable IP. I mean, I've been messaged by some of these guys, and you can just say Nazi stuff, and no one's going to do anything. And the same thing's true in reverse. You can be a communist. The difference, I think, is that many people in our upper intellectual elite are communists or Marxists. There's a famous study that was published to Econ Live in 2015. The date is just a few years prior to that. If anything, this has gotten worse. But they found that at least in the social sciences, 18% of professors were active Marxists. Um, Another, I think, 24% identified as political radicals, and 20.6% identified as radical activists. And these were asked as separate questions. So in total, it was about 60% of them. And to an extent that's as extreme as what you see on the alt-right or that sort of paraphilic block in society, but much more prevalent, you have Marxism as a social force in the USA. So I guess the point I'm making is that this drives a lot of the things that we've been talking about so far. Howard Zinn, who wrote an entire book, The People's History of the United States, devoted to making these kind of claims about America. We're an evil, genocidal country. They always talk about the two sins, slavery and genocide, so on down the line. He's an open communist. I mean, and there's an entire group, the Zinn Education Foundation, that was set up by this open Marxist to perpetuate very similar ideas throughout society. One of the things to come out of this sort of hidden fifth column is the whole idea of the Red Scare, which, as simply as I can put it, is the idea that in the 1950s and 60s, the USA went through a panic period of quote unquote McCarthyism. That's the term that's usually used, where innocent liberal academics and filmmakers like Dalton Trumbo were harassed and locked up, jailed, sometimes beaten for no reason. This is the narrative you get about the Red Scare if you sit down and read 15 high school textbooks, which I did. The reality is almost completely different. So I'm a political scientist, and one of the things you're kind of expected to do in the discipline is at least look through what are called the Venona cables, which are a series of releases from Russian intelligence during the Cold War that we decrypted when we were friendly with Russia in the late 90s. Russia was on the G8 at this time, so on down the line. And so we know who the Russian spies in the USA during the period of conflict between these two countries were. Like, we don't have to guess about that. We know who all of them were. If you just Google list of people in the Venona cables, it's on Britannica, it's on Wikipedia, so on down the line. And one of the things I found out then, and I reconfirmed while writing this book, is that virtually everyone we accused of spying for the Russians during the quote unquote Red Scare was actually spying for the Russians during the quote unquote Red Scare. I mean, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Alger Hiss, all of these people. I mean, the people at FDR's administration, all of them were commie spies. So the whole idea that the USA kind of panicked, it was sort of this working class movement led by that white trashy Joe McCarthy that was taking these innocents from the caring, genuine art scene and harassing them for no reason. Like, no, that's not real. We were involved in an existential conflict with a nuclear armed Russia, and they had a lot of agents in our country, as you'd expect. And we now know who those agents were. So that's the serious point that I would make about the quote unquote Red Scare. And I think the book does a pretty good job with that as well.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sitting with us and talking with us. Before we go, do you have anything you'd like to say to the audience at all?
I just one thing that I always say when I do these interviews is whether you're listening to someone on the right who sounds like your racist uncle, but with a few more studies, or someone on the left who more threateningly sounds like an actual communist. It sounds like what they're saying is nonsense. Common sense, your first mind is something to trust. I mean, not only is it the thing that's going to help you avoid violent brawls or sexual assaults or something like that in your actual life, it's also the thing that society recognizes gives you the ability to serve on professional juries, write op-eds for any newspaper in the country, so on down the line. It's a real thing. So one of the things that I keep finding during this book is that the commonsensical impressions of most people, like young white and native men probably often raided each other and committed atrocities, they may be politically incorrect, but they're almost always accurate. So I guess what I would say is that when someone is saying stuff that objectively, empirically sounds crazy, the odds that it is are very, very high. The odds that there are no women that have 9-inch penises are extremely high. So just believe in yourself, believe in your common sense, use logic is always my closing point.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, and everyone else, have a nice day.